When you think about Lake Tahoe before the pioneers moved west in the early 1800s.
The submersible slipped beneath the surface at 6:42 in the morning, and for the first 11 seconds, everything on the monitor looked like glass, not water, glass. You could see the aluminum frame of the vehicle reflected below it, the ropes trailing like dark threads, sunlight cutting straight down in solid golden columns that seemed to have no end. Lake Tahoe is famous for that clarity. On a still day, you can look over the side of a boat and watch a dropped coin flash and tumble for what feels like forever before it vanishes. And that morning, as the vehicle began its descent, the people crowded around the control screen on the deck fell quiet because they all knew where it was going: down past the point where any diver could safely follow, down toward a floor that, according to more than a century of stories, either didn't exist at all or was crowded with the dead. Because that is the thing about this lake. It carries two legends heavier than its own water. The first is that Tahoe has no bottom, that somewhere in its center, the rock simply drops away into a shaft that connects to other lakes, other rivers, maybe the sea itself, and that anything lost in it is lost forever. The second is darker. For decades, people have whispered that the cold black depths of Tahoe are a perfect tomb, that bodies sink into that frigid water and never rot, that mafia victims from the casino years lie down there in their suits, hair combed, faces calm, standing upright in the dark like a gallery of wax figures waiting for someone to find them. And the most famous version of that story, the one repeated at campfires and dock bars and in 1,000 internet threads, has a legendary diver surfacing from the deepest part of this very lake, pale and shaken, refusing to describe what he saw, saying only that the world isn't ready for what's down there. For 100 years, no one could prove any of it. The lake kept its secret the way it keeps everything: cold, silent, and out of reach. But that was about to change because for the first time, machines were going all the way to the bottom and the cameras were rolling. What they recorded did change everything, just not in the way the legends promised. Let's start with what the lake actually is, because the truth is more staggering than the folklore, and it explains exactly why those stories ever took hold. Lake Tahoe sits high in the Sierra Nevada, straddling the border of California and Nevada, cradled in a basin carved by faults and polished by ancient glaciers. From the shore, it looks almost gentle, a wide blue mirror ringed by pine and granite, ski slopes rising behind the beaches. But that surface is a lie about the size of the thing underneath it. Tahoe is one of the deepest lakes on the entire continent. At its deepest measured point, the floor lies roughly 1,645 feet below the surface. Say that number slowly, and it still doesn't quite register. So try it a different way. The Empire State Building, from the sidewalk to the tip of its antenna, stands about 1,454 foot tall. Drop that entire skyscraper into the deepest part of Lake Tahoe, and the top of it would still be nearly 200 foot underwater. You could stack it and stand a person on the roof, and they would never break the surface. Or picture the Eiffel Tower, 1,000 feet of iron lattice that dominates the Paris skyline. Sink it into Tahoe, and it wouldn't even reach 2/3 of the way down. There is that much water here, somewhere on the order of 39 trillion gallons of it, enough to cover the entire state of California more than a foot deep. It is not a lake in the way a summer pond is a lake. It is closer to a small, cold, freshwater sea, holding its own weather, its own currents, its own crushing pressure in the dark below. And it is the dark below that matters, because as that survey vehicle continued down through the golden columns of light, something began to happen on the monitor that anyone who has ever swam in a warm ocean would find deeply unsettling. The gold thinned, the blue deepened, and the temperature reading on the side of the screen, which had started at a pleasant 60-something degrees near the summer surface, began to fall. And then it stopped falling and simply held. This is the part of Tahoe that grew the legends, and it is completely real. In the surface layer, the lake warms in summer and cools in winter, behaving like water everywhere. But there is a boundary somewhere below 300 feet, past which the seasons stop meaning anything at all. Beneath that line, the water sits at a near constant temperature all year long, hovering just above 39 degrees Fahrenheit. The temperature at which fresh water is at its densest and heaviest, and therefore sinks and stays. It does not warm in July. It does not freeze in January. It simply holds in perpetual, motionless cold, in perpetual, absolute dark. Below about 700 feet, sunlight is gone entirely, not dim, gone. A camera down there sees nothing at all until it turns on its own lights. And even then, the beam only carves a small tunnel of visibility out of an ink-black nothing that stretches in every direction. And here is why the preserved body story sounds so convincing to anyone who hears the physics. In warm, oxygen-rich, bacteria-filled water, things break down fast. ice. Wood rots, metal corrodes, a body decomposes in days. But in cold like this, near freezing, still, and starved of oxygen, that whole process slows to a crawl. Bacteria that need warmth and air can barely function. Decomposition does not stop completely, but it drags out over spans of time that stop making intuitive sense. So, the claim took root that things which sink into the deep cold of Tahoe do not decay the way they should. That a shoe, a boat, a body could sit down there on that black floor for decades or even centuries looking very much the way they did the day the water swallowed them. It is a chilling idea, and it is grounded in just enough truth to be impossible to laugh off. So, the storytellers ran with it. They took the real depth, the real cold, the real preservation, and they built a mythology on top of it. A mythology of standing corpses and untouched suits and a diver too frightened to speak. For generations, no one could go down and check. The depth alone made it a place of the imagination rather than of evidence. But imagination has a way of hardening into something people swear is fact, and by the time the survey vehicles finally descended, half the region believed there was a graveyard waiting in the dark. The most famous piece of that mythology has a name attached to it, one of the most respected names in the history of the ocean. And to understand why that particular story refuses to die, you have to understand how powerful a single sentence becomes when it is placed in the mouth of the right man. The story goes that sometime in the 1970s, at the height of his fame, the legendary French explorer and filmmaker Jacques Cousteau brought a submersible to Lake Tahoe, that he descended, alone or nearly alone, into that near freezing dark, past the depths where any ordinary diver would die, all the way down toward the floor that no one had ever seen. And that when he came back up, he was not the same man. He was pale. He was quiet. Something had rattled the calm of a man who had spent his life staring into the abyss without flinching. And when someone finally asked him what he had found down there, he supposedly gave the answer that has echoed through campfire circles and internet forums for half a century. The world, he is said to have replied, isn't ready for what's down there. It is a perfect line. Read it aloud and feel how it works. Tells you nothing and implies everything. It doesn't describe a single object, and yet your mind rushes to fill the silence with bodies, with monsters, with whatever your own fear supplies. It transforms an ordinary cold lake into a sealed vault of forbidden knowledge guarded by the reluctance of a hero. If Cousteau of all people was too shaken to describe it, then it had to be something beyond ordinary horror. That single sentence did more to build Tahoe's dark reputation than any documented event ever could. It became the keystone. Everything else, the standing corpses, the intact suits, the mob victims, hung off of it. And here is where the survey story has to slow down and be honest, because this is the turn that reorients everything that follows. That quote, the one that anchors the entire legend, has no verifiable source. None. Search for where Cousteau actually said it. A recording, a transcript, an interview, a printed page with a date, and you come up with nothing solid. It is always attributed, never sourced. It floats from telling to telling, growing more dramatic each time, and yet no one can point to the moment it left his lips. There is no confirmed record that Cousteau ever dove the deepest part of Lake Tahoe at all. Members of his own family have spent decades quietly pushing back on the story, and still it survives because a great line does not need a source to spread. It only needs to be repeated. That matters, and it matters enormously because it tells you something about the whole mythology. The most famous piece of evidence for the horror at the bottom of Tahoe is a sentence that may never have been spoken by the man it is credited to. Pull that keystone out and you have to look at everything else hanging from it with fresh skeptical eyes. Not because the lake isn't deep, it is. Not because the cold doesn't preserve, it does. But because the leap from cold deep preserving water to a standing army of the dead was never made by evidence. It was made by storytelling. And once you see that, you start to want what the storytellers never had. You start to want to actually look. For most of the lake's history, that was impossible. And understanding exactly why is what makes the survey feel like such a threshold moment. Because the same conditions that fed the legend are the same conditions that keep human beings out. Deep diving anywhere is dangerous. Deep diving here is a special category of lethal. And it stacks its hazards in ways that surprise even experienced divers. First, there is the raw depth. The floor of the deepest basin sits well beyond 1,000 feet. And recreational scuba diving becomes deadly long before that. And most divers have no business past 130 feet, where nitrogen begins to act on the brain like a slow anesthetic. Push deeper and the pressure crushes in. The gases in your blood turn treacherous. And every foot down multiplies the time and precision required to come back up alive. Then there is the cold. That near freezing water beneath the boundary layer does not just chill you. It strips the heat from a human body with brutal efficiency. And even in a sealed dry suit, time in that dark becomes a countdown. And then, layered on top of both, there is a factor most people never think about. Altitude. Lake Tahoe sits more than 6,000 feet above sea level. The air is thinner up there, and the physics of pressure and gas that every dive table is built on shift accordingly. A dive that would be routine at the coast becomes an equation with a narrower margin of error up in the mountains, where the surface itself is already high. Depth, cold, and altitude braided together. It is a place engineered almost to keep the living out and to keep its floor unseen. So, for generations, the bottom of Tahoe stayed exactly where the myth wanted it, in the imagination, beyond reach, unfalsifiable. You could believe whatever you liked about it, because no one could go down and prove you wrong. And that is precisely the vacuum that machines were built to fill. If a human body cannot survive the descent, you send something that has no body to lose. You send sonar, pulses of sound fired down into the dark, timed as they bounce back. Each returning echo a single point of measurement that, gathered by the millions, can be stitched into a map of a shape no eye has ever seen whole. And you send remotely operated vehicles, tethered robots trailing cables back up to a boat on the surface, carrying lights and cameras and instruments down into the cold on your behalf, feeding everything they see back up the line to a bank of glowing monitors where human beings sit warm and dry and watch. That is the quiet revolution at the heart of this entire story. Not a brave diver, not a submersible carrying a shaken explorer, a methodical, patient, unglamorous sweep, a survey running grid lines back and forth across the whole basin the way a farmer plows a field, mapping every foot of a floor that legend insisted could not be mapped because it did not exist. The people running it were not hunting for corpses. They were doing science, charting the shape of the basin, studying its slopes and sediment, understanding the lake as a living system. But whether they intended it or not, the moment those pulses started returning clean, measurable echoes from a solid bottom, they had already begun to dismantle the oldest myth of all. And as the first vehicle slipped beneath the impossibly clear surface and began their descent, the monitors in the control room lit with an image that started, deceptively, as pure and shining blue. A blue so clean it looked artificial. The kind of clarity that has made Tahoe famous for as long as anyone has been writing about it. In the first 10, 20, 30 feet, the water on the monitors barely seemed like water at all. It was glass. The ROV's own frame cast a shadow on the boulders below, and the operators could count individual pebbles, could see the wavering seams of light rippling across pale granite sand like a net thrown over the bottom of a swimming pool. Someone in the control room said quietly that you could read a newspaper down there, and for the first 30 feet that was almost true. But clarity is not depth, and the two things behave very differently the deeper you go. The vehicle kept descending, its thrusters humming through the tether, and the monitors began to change in a way that was slow enough to be beautiful and fast enough to be unsettling. The bright sunlit blue thickened. The pebbles lost their sharp edges. Colors began to leave the picture one by one, the way they always do underwater. First the reds and oranges went bleeding out of everything until the world was rendered in greens and blues, and then even those dimmed. The depth read out in the corner of the screen ticked upward with a patient, mechanical steadiness that nobody in that room could look away from. 100 feet, 200. The sunlight that had made the surface so dazzling was now a memory somewhere far overhead, a faint pale ceiling that shrank with every meter of cable that paid out over the side of the boat. By 300 feet, the ROV's own lights were doing all the work. The camera pushed a cone of white illumination into water that had gone the deep, ink-touched blue of dusk, and beyond that cone there was nothing. Not darkness exactly, but the total absence of anything to see. This is the threshold the old stories were built around. This is where the refrigerator effect takes hold, where the temperature settles into that steady, unmoving cold that never changes with the seasons, where the pressure has already crushed the margin for any unprotected human being to a sliver. And it was right here, in this transitional gloom, that the survey recorded the first thing that genuinely stopped the room. Trees. Not debris, not a trick of the sediment. On the sonar returns first, and then in the ROV's floodlights, there stood the unmistakable forms of trees, upright, rooted, their trunks rising from the lake bed as if the water around them were simply air. Some had lost their branches to the centuries. Others held ghostly, skeletal limbs that reached upward into the black. They stood in the posture of a forest, spaced the way a forest spaces itself, anchored where they had grown. And they were 300 feet below a surface that boats crossed every summer afternoon. For a moment, the room was silent, and you can understand why. There is something profoundly wrong feeling about a standing tree at the bottom of a lake. A log rolling in the shallows is one thing. The imagination files it away easily. But a tree that is still rooted, still vertical, still occupying the exact spot where it once grew towards sunlight, that is a landscape that has been submerged whole. That is a piece of dry country that the water came up and swallowed without knocking anything over. And the cold, sterile, low-oxygen environment that the legends had wrapped around preserved corpses had, it turned out, done something far more verifiable. It had kept these trunks intact for an astonishing span of time. When samples were eventually dated, the numbers came back in the range of thousands of years. 6,000 by some estimates. Would that had been standing underwater since before the pyramids? And that raised a question the survey could measure but not fully answer. A question that hangs over the whole basin once you know the trees are there. A tree cannot grow underwater. For those trees to have grown at all, the surface of Tahoe must once have stood hundreds of feet lower than it does today. Low enough that this stretch of ground was open forest, breathing air, catching mountain light, which means that at some point the level of the lake rose and rose enormously by a margin that would drown a modern skyline. The uncomfortable part is not that the water rose. Lakes rise. The uncomfortable part is how gently it must have done so. A violent flood, a wall of water, a sudden catastrophic surge snaps trees, uproots them, lays them flat, and drags them into tangled heaps. It does not leave a forest standing at attention. Whatever raised Tahoe over those trees did it slowly enough or strangely enough that the forest simply stopped living and stayed exactly where it stood. A drowned woodland holding its formation in the dark. The survey could show you that it happened, could not tell you with any comfort exactly how. So the monitors held that image, the pale trunks, the reaching limbs, the sand between them undisturbed, and then the survey did what surveys do. It moved on. The thrusters hummed, the depth readout resumed its climb, and the drowned forest slid out of frame and back into the blackness it had waited in for 6,000 years. 400 feet, 500. The water was total night now, and the only sensory world left was the one the machine manufactured. The white cone of the lights, the green wash of the sonar display, the numbers, and the faint steady tick of the tether feeding out. In that control room, warm and dry and bright, it was easy to forget for whole minutes at a time that everything they were watching existed in a place that would kill an unprotected person in the time it takes to read this sentence. The ordinary comfort of the monitors sat right up against the extraordinary hostility of what they showed. Somewhere past 600 feet, the sonar operators leaned in. They had been running clean grid lines, watching the floor resolve tile by tile into the first true map anyone had ever made of this basin, and something in the returns had changed. The soft, even signature of sediment had given way to a scatter of harder echoes, shapes small and distinct clustered where the smooth data said there should only be silt. On a sonar screen, a cluster of hard returns is not yet a story. Could be rock, could be a rock slide. It could be 100 perfectly ordinary things that a lake bed accumulates over 10,000 years. But it could, in the frame that every old Tahoe legend had trained people to fear, be something else entirely. And for the length of time it took to steer the vehicle over for a closer look, no one in that room was willing to say out loud what shapes at 600 feet clustered together on the floor of a lake famous for hiding its dead might turn out to be. So they held their breath, and they sent the lights down toward the cluster, and they watched the black water slowly give up its edges one gray shape at a time. And what the lights found, when the ROV finally hung over that cluster and steadied itself in the current, was not a body. It was not 9 bodies arranged in a deliberate ring, and it was not a single man in a 1940s suit standing upright with his eyes open and a pocket watch ticking against his ribs. The white cones settled, the sediment glowed, and the hard returns resolved into shapes that were almost insulting in how ordinary they were. Bottles, cans, a tangle of what might once have been fishing gear fused now into a single knotted mass by decades of cold and pressure. A tire, the corner of something rusted flat and unreadable trash. 600 foot down in one of the clearest, most protected lakes on the continent, the survey had steered its lights toward the darkest legend Tahoe owned, and it had found garbage. You could hear it in the control room, that particular silence that follows a held breath release. Not disappointment exactly, something more complicated. Because the machine had just done the one thing the legends could never survive. It had looked plainly and completely at the place the story said held the dead, and it had found only the things the living had thrown away. This was the moment that the whole enterprise turned, and it turned quietly, the way real revelations usually do. There was no leaked tape, there was no frantic call to the authorities, no site sealed off, no cluster of human silhouettes that some diver would whisper about for the rest of his life. There was a comprehensive sonar map, built line by patient line, and there were hours of ROV footage. And together they said something that 100 years of folklore had never wanted to hear. Tahoe is not bottomless. It has a bottom roughly 1,645 feet down, and that bottom is now mapped in more detail than most people's own neighborhoods. And the bottom does not hold a field of perfectly preserved corpses hovering upright in the cold. The refrigerator effect is real. The water down there truly is dark and frigid and hostile to decay. But the cathedral of the dead that legend built inside it simply was not there. The cameras looked everywhere a body was supposed to be, and they found the lake bed instead. And here is the thing about the man in the suit, and the 9 figures, and the corpse with the ticking watch, and Cousteau surfacing pale and shaken with a warning he could never share. When you go looking for the source of those stories, you find that the trail evaporates before you reach solid ground. The famous line that the world isn't ready for what's down there has no verified origin, no recording, no interview, no page anyone can point to. The family most associated with that legendary diver has spent decades saying it never happened, that he did not descend into Tahoe's deepest dark and come back haunted, that the quote is a ghost with no body of its own. The legend, it turns out, is exactly like the corpses it describes. Everyone knows someone who saw it and no one can produce it, but the survey did find something. That is the part that lands harder than any monster could, because it is true. true and because it is ours. Across the mapped floor of Lake Tahoe, in the shallows and out into the deep blue and down into the cold black, the cameras recorded litter. Not a curiosity, not a stray bottle, a startling accumulating scatter of human debris, glass and aluminum and plastic, music and sunken junk. Decades of it resting on the sediment of a lake that people drive hundreds of miles to stand beside and call pristine. The very cold and stillness that the legends promised would preserve bodies had instead preserved our garbage, holding it intact and legible on the floor of one of the most beautiful lakes in North America. That is the truth. The machines carried up the tether. Tahoe is not a vault of the dead. It is a vault of what we didn't bother to carry back out. And in its own quiet way, that is more unsettling than the ghost story. A monster you can fear from a safe distance. A field of preserved corpses is a legend that asks nothing of you but a shiver. But a floor scattered with bottles and cans is a mirror, and it does not let you look away, because every piece down there came from a hand like yours, on a boat or ashore, on an ordinary summer day. The survey that was supposed to confirm the darkest myths of Tahoe ended up confirming something plainer and far more demanding, that the lake has been quietly swallowing our carelessness for generations and holding on to every piece. That finding did not vanish into a filing cabinet. It became the reason for the work that followed, the use to guide cleanup, to send divers and machines back down, not to hunt for the dead, but to haul up what the living left. Bottle by bottle, tire by tire, from a floor that finally, for the first time, someone could actually see. The myths dissolve, but the responsibility they'd been hiding did not. So, the old questions can rest now. The lake is not bottomless. It has a measured floor. It is not a graveyard of standing corpses. It is a graveyard of our litter. The Cousteau warning was never spoken by the man it's pinned to. The drowned forest is real and genuinely strange, still standing at its silent attention 6,000 years on. And the honest answer to how it got there is simply that we don't fully know yet, which is a far better mystery than a made-up one, because it's true, and someone reading this might one day help solve it. The Washoe held this basin sacred for longer than any of the stories that came later, and their reverence for its water reads very differently now, less like superstition and more like the oldest and clearest instruction anyone ever gave about this place, that it deserves care. The bottom of Lake Tahoe held no bodies and no monster. It held the trees we didn't plant, the past we can't yet explain, and the trash we did leave. The cameras went down expecting a legend and came back with a mirror. So, I want to hear from you. Did you grow up believing Lake Tahoe was bottomless, or that its cold black depths were hiding the dead? And now that the floor is mapped and the truth is litter instead of legend, what do you honestly think we should do about the garbage a treasured lake has been swallowing for 100 years? Tell me down in the comments, and if you want to keep going to the places no diver can reach, subscribe, because there's always a deeper floor to look at next.